A class of civilizations is occurring throughout the world today, a war of cultures at various levels in both our personal and public lives. This class is partly because of rising historical and cultural awareness on the part of newly independent countries, beginning with India. The Western European North American culture is currently predominant and is strongly, if not rudely, trying to eliminate or subordinate the rest. Yet, Western civilization is spreading itself not so much by force as in the colonial era, but by subtle new forms of social manipulation. These include control of the media and news information networks, control of the entertainment industry, domination of commercial markets, continued missionary aggressiveness by Western religions, and, as important but sometimes overlooked, control of educational institutions and curricula worldwide. The control of education has resulted in a Western European North American view of history and culture in history books and information sources in most countries, including India. Naturally, people educated according to Western values will function as part of Western culture, whatever may be the actual country of their birth. They will experience an alienation from their native culture in which they have not really been raised. They easily become a fifth column for the westernization of their culture, which also means its denigration, or at best, its commercialization. An authentic Indian or Indic perspective, a worldview coming out of the culture of India and its particular values and perceptions, is hardly to be found even in India. The Western school of thought is taught in India, not any Indic or Indian school of thought. So, what is the Indian school of thought? The Indic school of thought is not something new or unknown. It is the great spiritual, philosophical, scientific, artistic, and cultural traditions of the subcontinent that are among the largest and oldest in the world. It is the emphasis on dharma, on karma, on pluralism and synthesis, on yoga, sadhana, and moksha. It is not only the tradition of ancient sages from the Vedas and Upanishads to Buddhist and yoga traditions, but also modern teachers like Sri Aurobindo and Swami Vivekananda. It is not only the vast literature of Sanskrit, but also that of regional languages and dialects of the subcontinent, most of which have older literary traditions than the languages of Europe, such as English. All major cultural debates are now framed according to the Western values and perceptions, and so they will naturally serve to uphold them. The important issues of Indic civilization today are framed according to the principles or biases of the Western school of thought. These include what Indian civilization is, when India as a nation first arose, what the real history of India is, how to reform Indian society, and how India should develop in order to have its rightful place in the future of the world. As the debate is defined according to the approach and values of Western civilization, India does not fare well, and India, as its own independent source of civilization, is seldom acknowledged. India is judged as if it should be another USA, UK, or Germany, which it can never be, nor should be. This only makes Indians feel inferior or wrong. The Western school of thought negates the relevance of the traditions of India. That is not simply because the Indic tradition is wrong, unsophisticated, or irrelevant. It is because Western civilization is homogeneous, if not predatory in nature, and such ideas help promote its spread. Its information about India contains a built-in poison. It is meant to undermine the culture of the region and subordinate it to the West, however objective, scientific, or modern its approach may appear to be. In these current cultural debates, therefore, an overriding greater debate is ignored. that which takes place between the Western and Indic schools of thought. The Western-style media and academia tries to see what is authentic in Indian civilization and finds it to be wanting, reducing it to little more than caste or superstition. This is not surprising, as the Indic tradition has a different focus and values than does the Western tradition. Similarly, from the standpoint of the Indic tradition, we must question Western civilization itself. Is the Western school of thought enlightened? Is it appropriate for India? Can it understand the unique civilization of the subcontinent? So let's come to secular missionaries. The West similarly tries to control any debate on cultural ethics using slogans of democracy and human rights, which are only used to intimidate weak nations and conveniently ignored relevant to stronger or wealthier nations like China or Saudi Arabia. Organizations operating under the cover of human rights are amongst the most aggressive, alienating influences today. They function like secular missionaries, ignoring victims of terrorism like the Hindus, while defending the rights of terrorist organizations against security forces that are compelled to take action against them. Meanwhile, it is the West that is selling the weapons and profiting by terrorism and civil strife throughout the world. The West originally trained many terrorist groups such as the Taliban fighters in Afghanistan. Such groups highlight social inequalities in India, but ignore a larger colonial history behind it all, marked by attacks on indigenous Indic culture, the same charges of cultural backwardness that have been used throughout the cultural colonial era to undermine the native traditions of Africa, Asia, and the USA, and to justify forced religious conversions and political domination, which is their real aim. Sometimes native intellectuals are taken in by these Western approaches to social issues, not realizing that they are just promoting the colonial agenda of world domination in a more covert form. New rules of debate. The world today needs a critique of modern civilization from an Indic or Dharmic perspective, an interpretation of capitalism, socialism, communism, Christianity, and Islam, from a tradition that is much older, deeper, and closer to the spirit in both man and nature. These Western ideologies are failing to address the spiritual needs of humanity and are incapable of creating a world order that transcends dogmatism or exclusivism. Those of us who are part of the Indic school of thought should emphasize such a greater debate and not get caught in the details of issues already formulated according to the biases of Western civilization. This debate should examine the right structure for society and the real forward direction for history and evolution. We must raise fundamental questions. Is the current Western materialistic view of history valid at all? Or are there spiritual forces at work in the world that go beyond all these? Can we understand our history through outer approaches like archaeology, linguistics, or genetics? Or is a higher consciousness or a more intuitive view required as well? Are the records of our ancient sages to be rejected so lightly whenever we think that they do not agree with our views? The real issue of the Vedas, India's oldest tradition, is not how these texts might fit into the current model of history is promoted by the Western school of thought, tracing the development of civilization through outward material advances. It is how the existence of such an ancient tradition of rishis, knowers of cosmic consciousness, shows a higher spiritual humanity from which we have arisen and whose legacy we can reclaim towards a new school of thought. India needs a new type of scholarship, an Indic school of thought that has its own values, traditions, and methods of reaching conclusions. Those of us who follow the Indian civilization should develop this Indic school of thought in its own right, and not merely try to justify our views in terms of the Western or European school of thought, which is hostile and radically opposed to Indic cultural tradition. Recently raised a call for an intellectual Kshatriya in India, a new class of warrior intellectuals to defend India and its great pluralistic traditions from the onslaught of Western exclusivist approaches, whether religious, economic, or political. This call fundamentally requires the creation of such a new Indic school of thought. Such a new Indic school of thought concerns not only philosophers or liberation or yoga, but Indic, Hindu, and Dharmic approaches to ecology, the global marketplace, health, science, the status of women, religious freedom, in short, to all the main issues in society today. And it should also look beyond these issues, which are often the issues of the Western school, to yet broader concerns. How can we integrate humanity and nature with its underlying cosmic intelligence? How can we reclaim our spiritual heritage as a species that the great yogis have pointed out for us? Such a new Indic school of thought requires new institutions to promote and embody it, or new Vedic schools. This will arise not only through Indianology departments in Western-style universities, but through a type of institution with its own funding and curriculum free from manipulation by the vested interests and ideologies of the Western school and its religious, commercial, and political bias. An intellectual renaissance. The problem is that the Western school created Indian academic institutions that reflect Western values. To try to gain credibility for Indic thought in the context of European institutions, as some well-meaning Hindus are attempting, may be a helpful strategy, but misses the main point. Western universities have their own agendas that they will not readily give up. They will not change simply because a few well-intentioned people and groups give them money and sponsor positions to project a more sympathetic picture of India and her civilization. Like a sea that salts every river that flows into it, existing trends and interests will force the people coming into them to conform to the dominant Eurocentric values that pervade these institutions. Otherwise, they cannot survive academically. It is not on single issues that we need to make headway, but on promoting the Indic tradition as a complete school of thought in itself, rather than merely a side subject of Indianological study in Western-defined academia. We must look back to such Indic models as Namishar, Takshalya, Nalandya, or Mitylania, not only to their institutions, but also to the Gurukul approach and its more intimate and spiritual form of learning. I urge the young people and the scholars of today, of India, to take up this cause. Do not try to defend India in the context of civilization as defined by the West. Instead, look to the great traditions of India that have their own deeper roots and use it to critique Western civilization and discover its limitations, rather than seeking to define and control India according to the Western perspectives. The West should look to India for guidance on the deeper issues of culture and spirituality. Indians, in turn, should assert their own great traditions and not simply imitate the West or seek to justify Indian civilization from a Western perspective. True scholars of the Indic tradition need not go to Harvard or Oxford to seek credibility. Rather, these institutions should come to them.